May the things we think, the things we say and the things we do be always acceptable in your sight, Lord, our strength, our hope and future. Amen. You might have noticed that Jesus made a comment about those guys getting around in long robes, so we know Jesus must have worn board shorts everywhere he went, I guess. Not quite the image of him that you had in your mind, is it? He said, beware! Beware those religious professionals getting around in their hipster jeans and their slick suits and their long robes. They like to be fawned over down the street. Have the movers and shakers and celebrities rock up to their services, get the best seats in the cool coffee shops and the box seats at the footy. Behind the scenes, they're the lowest form of greedy scum, but publicly they're just faking it. Wait, what? Hey, Jesus, just chill out, mate. Don't you know these are the good guys? These are the people we look up to and respect? How can you say those things? Don't you know what they've done for the church? For the community? Shouldn't we honour them and spoil them a little bit for their hard work, their holy work? Let's remember that the Hebrew scriptures state again and again and again and again, to the point of almost being ridiculous, that God's people must absolutely prioritise the well-being of the poor, the orphans, the widows, the refugees and immigrants. It wasn't for no reason. It's because God's people were saved from the brutality of being mistreated slaves in a foreign nation. That's the reason. So look after the downtrodden. In fact, how we treat the least among us is how God shall judge his own people, both then and now. Because how we treat the least among us is how we treat the King himself. It was no coincidence that this little incident happened at the end of Jesus' earthly ministry and just before his crucifixion and resurrection. One of the scribes had just publicly endorsed Jesus' teaching about loving God and loving neighbour and how they are inseparable. Here's one really tragic example of how that is not happening. Judgment was about to fall on their entire system, their entire way of life. And judgment was about to fall on the temple. Here was a very obvious sign that their system was utterly corrupt and broken and failed the most vulnerable. While the fat cats were tipping in their stonking great amounts of cash, which didn't really dent their wallets, the destitute widow goes uncared for and completely unnoticed by all the people gathered except Jesus. He sees her and he celebrates her. Contrast the bishops, priests and deacons, the pastors and ministers, the rich landowners and businessmen and their fat bank accounts with the mighty widow. She's going all in for God, giving her last $2. If we ain't hurting, we ain't giving. She gets it. Shame that that last $2 is probably going to support just the kind of person that Jesus warns them about. The kind of person who is siphoning off her cash, her pension, the very folks that Jesus says, watch out. Publicly they look all right, but behind the scenes. Contrast the mighty widow taking a huge flying leap of trust that God will look after her, when the people who should know better, the religious leaders, will not. She's putting in her trust in God, not in people. And these blokes who should be looking after her, where are they putting their trust? In money, and power, and fame. This mighty widow is awesome. She trusts in God with everything, and it is breathtaking. And she is a pointer to what Jesus himself is about to experience and do. As a poor man he will be cast aside by the respectable and wealthy religious leaders. He'll then go all in with God, die on the cross, trusting his life into his Father's hands and trusting the salvation of the world into his Father's hands. All that might feel like a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But do you remember back to the 80s? Do you remember Jimmy Swaggart? Multi-millionaire televangelist, making his money off donations from the poor, using that money on prostitutes, then going to prison, then coming back out like nothing ever happened and continuing to preach. Where do you think his dough comes from? I wonder how many widows still have Jimmy Swaggart going on their television all day, every day and sending him money. Just a few years ago, a guy called Jesse Duplantis, televangelist, asked his followers to buy him a brand new private jet for $54 million. And you know what his reason was? Because Jesus wouldn't ride a donkey these days to take the gospel places. Jesus warned us, didn't he? And remember the stink from the start of this year when our Prime Minister tried to get his good mate, Pastor Brian Houston of Hillsong fame, a seat at the dinner table with himself and President Joe Biden. And that, of course, blew up in everyone's faces. They're just some big ticket examples. And this is not to unpack the sadly more sinister ways that religious professionals have grievously exploited the vulnerable to their own gratification and ends. And we've heard all those stories in the news too many times, haven't we? Again, though, all that might seem a bit far removed from us. I wonder if we've been sad ourselves that the church, capital C, has lost its place in society, a place of privilege and power and influence. We were so powerful and influential once that there was nowhere you could go but church on a Sunday. And some of you will remember those days. The shop shut, there was no sport, there was nowhere else to go. That is a sign of power and influence and privilege. I wonder if we feel sad that we don't have the cash or the people that we once used to have in the church. I wonder, have we lost ground as the church, capital C, because we took our eyes off the poor, the orphans, the widows, the refugees and the immigrants? What about even closer to home? I can't help but thinking when I read a passage like this how much it has a go at me and my colleagues, because so often we are amongst the best paid and most consistently paid workers in our town or our district. It makes me deeply uncomfortable and distressed. I also note, after being a priest in this diocese for 16 years, that every year the stipend keeps creeping up. This passage is a bit ouchy for we clergy in our diocese, because we might be just in a little tiny bit of danger of being the kind of people that Jesus warned others about. I pray not. The reason given behind our stipend going up every year is that, we've got to be able to attract clergy to the diocese. So that leaves me wondering, wow, what are their priorities? And this passage alarms me. Yet it has been my joy and delight over many, many years to bear witness to countless acts of extraordinary generosity, both large and small. It was just the other day that Katrina and I were down the street, and there was someone we knew who has done it tough in life, probably not all that cashed up, sitting there eating a little container of hot chips, and she saw us and was overjoyed and hugged us and insisted we share her chips with us. And I was pretty sure that was the only meal she would eat that day. And I was moved to tears by that generosity. Some of the most memorable and touching and wholehearted acts of generosity that I've ever witnessed have been done by people with the very least. So here's the thing to celebrate. End to end, in this diocese, the most common parishioner we have, the backbone of our diocese, is the mighty widow, followed closely by all those women who have to come to church without their husbands, and all those single women in the church. Pretty much our whole church is made up of women, but the backbone is the mighty widow. Some might see that as a deficit. You know, we want families and kids to come to church. Well, of course we do. But the fact that our backbone, the thing that holds us together and makes us strong, is the mighty widow, is something to celebrate. In light of today's passage, it is an incredible strength, because the mighty widow has given sacrificially to God's mission for decades. They have worked hard for decades, trying everything they possibly can to pass on their greatest treasure, the good news of God in Jesus. From talking about it and praying with people and witnessing in their homes and the street, to flogging sausage rolls and everything else. They have done everything in their power to share the good news of Jesus. Even if it is not received, they keep on going. Because of them, the Anglican Church is still present in towns and localities that most other churches, organisations and businesses have abandoned or long since forgotten. The mighty widows have dug deep and refused to give up when others have thrown in the towel. We can fight on today because of you. So thank you. We have your example to look up to and to follow, because you are the first to follow truly in the footsteps of Jesus. So my question for the rest of us is, are we all in, like the mighty widow in our story, like the mighty widows who have followed her, who gave her last $2 and took a flying leap of trust to put everything she had into the hands of God? Jesus asks you today, who do you want to be when you grow up in the faith? Who is it that you want to follow? Amen.